Hi everyone, and welcome to Poly 100, and welcome to my basement. Obviously, this semester is a little bit different than Poly 100s in the past, but I think we're going to make it just fine. Today I want to introduce the first module of the course by thinking carefully about some of the overarching phenomena or overarching sort of concepts that we'll be talking about throughout the course. Really, when we think about political science and its history, all the way back, maybe even 100 years ago, we think about how political scientists have sort of almost always been concerned not just with questions of who or what or when, maybe some of the questions that you thought about in civics classes that you may have taken in high school or in middle school or even in elementary school a long, long ago, or maybe never. We don't always think about these questions, though. We don't always concern ourselves with questions about, when the Mayflower landed or, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Really, what we're most interested in as political scientists are questions that really think about why. We want to know why certain political phenomena are occurring. We want to know how and why those things have come to be. Right? We want to know how political concepts, political actors, political institutions interact and what the consequences of those interactions might be. So these questions that are founded really by why or driven by the why principle, I think are the most important for our purposes as well, given that we're now entering into a political science sort of coursework that is at the college level. And so I think that the sort of why questions over the last 100 years of political science have really been driven by sort of three overarching principles or three organizing principles. Certainly this is not an exclusive list, but it's one that I think helps us heuristically or sort of as a kind of mental shortcut ground what we're going to be talking about in the future in the course. And so these sort of three approaches I would sort of argue are as this. Economic is maybe the first approach. And really, this is one where if you've taken an economics class, maybe you've enrolled in Econ 101 or something this semester, or maybe you've taken it in the past, you might really think about some of the terms from that class like rationality or the rationality principle or utility. Really, this is all about analyzing how individuals make decisions given some basic assumptions about their penchant for maximizing their benefits and minimizing their costs. The second approach that we can think about is the historical sociological approach. This is really I've kind of crunched a couple of approaches together in here. But really this approach, many political scientists are very deeply interested in how social groups and historical forces sort of interact to produce political outcomes. So we might think about group norms, sort of patterns of behavior, formal rules that these groups might have and hold to, historical traditions, the way the groups behave on the basis of long-standing sort of principles. We're really interested as historical sociological political scientists on how those kinds of social interactions affect politics. And then finally, the third one that we can think about is one that I use very often in my own research, that is the psychological approach. And this approach is really thinking about the way that sort of your brain reacts to the world of politics, how political stimuli are processed and understood by the human brain, given its inherent limitations and its inherent sort of wacky ways of being. So these are kind of three potential approaches to the study of politics that many contemporary scholars sort of work under. If you think about it, if you've already been taking a look at the textbook for the course, which I really encourage you to do, these approaches actually, I think, relate really closely to the five major so-called principles of politics that the textbook talks about. So I'm just going to briefly introduce those again. You can obviously see these in the textbook, but think about how these three sort of major ways that political scientists study politics map onto the five principles in the textbook. The first being that humans are rational. Certainly the economic principle, I think, maps onto this very carefully. Politics being driven by individuals' sort of rational calculations, benefits and costs. The second being that institutions are very powerful, getting back to the historical sociological principle, this idea that formal and informal rules and norms have a lot to do with the way that politics works today. Third being, I think, a really important key point that doesn't come across as easily in those three foundational sort of guiding approaches is this emphasis on collective action, right? Contrasting to the humans are rational approach, we might think about the fact that humans really only accomplish things politically when they work together. So individual atomized people are not always going to have a big impact, but when they start to coalesce into groups and engage in collective action in a meaningful way, that's when we see sort of the political fireworks. Fourth is the idea that policy is really the outcome that we care about as political scientists, right? Political science, we might see in some other content modules, is really focused on this guiding question of who gets what. And so the policy is really the what, right? These are the outcomes that structure what kinds of things people get, essentially at the most basic level in our society. And so we really care about policy because these outcomes matter for who gets what. And then finally, and I think very importantly in today's context, is this idea that history is something that we can't dispense with. We can't forget about the fact that history is driving outcomes in political ways that don't always make sense from any of these other potential approaches, right? Historical context, for example, think about the party platforms of this year, right? The two parties' major platforms might be very incomprehensible to us if we didn't understand how those two parties have evolved over time, from 2016 to now, from 2008 to now, from the 1800s to now. These are very important sort of principles to keep in mind, given that politics is incomprehensible, I think, without a firm grasp of the historical record. So really, this is just to introduce you to some very broad overarching principles. And I think that certainly in the abstract, they don't make a tremendous amount of sense. They don't have a tremendous amount of impact. What I think would be very helpful to you is to keep these in mind, though. As we go through the course, we're going to talk about a number of different topics, from the presidency to Congress to public policy to interest groups and lobbying, all kinds of different topics. And all of these topics, I think, are better understood and more easily digested when we try to apply these principles, sort of the three sort of broadest ways that we study politics and sort of these five kind of mnemonic guiding principles. Every time we apply those, I think we make better sense of some of the sort of nuts and bolts of the topics we'll be studying. So try to spot them throughout the course, and I think you're going to have a much better time as a result. So I look forward to seeing you again in the next module.